Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. It's a very special and a very timely discussion ahead of a federal election that is being described as a referendum on nuclear power and a sliding doors moment for renewable energy in our country. My name is Dave Sweeney. I'm emceeing tonight. I'm a nuclear policy analyst and campaigner with the Australian Conservation Foundation. I'm talking to you tonight from Naarm, Melbourne, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and wanted to start tonight with a special acknowledgement of the lands that all of us are on from around this country, to acknowledge the unbroken connection of traditional owners and custodians and the sustained and leading role of First Nations people right across the continent of Australia in protecting country and resisting nuclear risk and imposition. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. We'll be keeping the microphones muted tonight, and that's to minimise distraction, disturbance, and any loud chewing noises. We will be recording so that we can share this information with others into the future, and it's a resource. If you don't want to be part of that, if you're not comfortable with that, turn off the camera, and you know, that will take care of that. Otherwise, we are recording. We will have the chat open. We can take questions in chat. Unfortunately, we haven't got the time or the ability tonight to do question and answer in a more interactive dialogue. But if you have questions, put them in the chat, please. If you have particular themes that either animate you, concern you particularly, or you'd like further information on, put them in the chat. They will both inform future material and future resources produced by Don't Nuke the Climate and others, but we'll also do our best to respond following this event. Tonight's event is part of the National Sustainable Living Festival, and that's Australia's longest running festival looking for creative ideas to urgent problems. And we wanted to acknowledge and thank the SLF crew for both their big picture and continuing vision and for their specific support for this evening's event. The forum has been coordinated and hosted by Don't Nuke the Climate Australia, which is the local chapter of a global civil society initiative, which is dedicated to the clean energy transition, effective and urgent climate action, and avoiding the delay and the distraction and the risk of nuclear promotion. So tonight we are going to explore some of the obvious and less obvious implications of Peter Dutton and the Federal Coalition's plan for domestic nuclear power. We all know that the coal era is ending, and we need to make significant choices in relation to Australia's energy future. So the question is this proposal by the coalition a good faith one or a very bad one? We're lucky, I think my view is clear, but we're lucky tonight to have a broad range of others, voices, hearts and minds to share their experience and take us on this journey. At the start, we'll hear from Dr. Jim Green about some of the latest updates of the nuclear industry internationally and some of the specifics and some of the concerns of the coalition proposal. We'll also have opportunities to hear from Dr. Margaret Beavis from the Medical Association for the Prevention of War around health implications, Wendy Farmer from Gippsland's Voices of the Valley about local community considerations and concerns. We can hear and will hear from Joe Sutton from the ETU, the Electrical Trades Union, 50,000 plus strong, who power this country, about their view of this issue and also importantly its relationship and implications for Australia's renewable energy sector. We also will hear from Scott Ludlam, who has been exploring some of the drivers and politics behind the current atomic agenda. So it's a broad range geographically, It's a broad range across a political spectrum and a range of lenses and viewpoints that are coming to this to share some information about what is a pivotal energy and more decision for our country. We start tonight with Dr. Jim Green. Many of you on this webinar will know of or have heard of Jim. He's a very recognised commentator on nuclear issues in this country, and not just in this country, internationally. Jim was a former editor of the World Information Service on Energy's Nuclear Monitor. He is an active member of the prestigious European-based nuclear consulting group. He's a leading expert on the status of nuclear power internationally and the situation and constraints and hurdles facing nuclear power proposals in Australia. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Jim tonight.
Thanks very much, Dave. First, I would, of course, like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, the Dja Wurrung. And I also am a little disturbed to see in the chat representatives from the Mineral Council of Australia and a group called Nuclear for Australia. Both of those groups lie shamelessly. They lie all day, every day. They should be ashamed of themselves. And the purpose of my brief presentation is to debunk some of their lies, and also the lies coming from the Coalition and the Murdoch media. So the Coalition's nuclear power plan, sorry, I'm having some problems with my sharing here. So power reactors at 7 sites, could be multiple reactors at these sites, so-called small modular reactors in South Australia and Western Australia, large reactors in the eastern states, government funded, and that's telling. This is a proposal that industry would not touch with a barge pole. And if this plan goes ahead, nuclear power might supply roughly 10% of Australia's electricity demand. There's a high degree of uncertainty with that estimate, but the point is that it's certainly not a silver bullet. Nuclear power is in decline. I guess this is the first lie being peddled by Nuclear for Australia and the Minerals Council and the Coalition and the Murdoch media that 50 countries are planning to introduce nuclear power and we're going to get left behind and we're going to miss the boat. Well, here are some facts which I'll run through at pace. Nuclear power's contribution to global electricity generation is just 9.1%. That's barely half its historic peak. Nuclear has not grown at all for 20 years. Last year, nuclear growth of 4 gigawatts compared to renewables growth of 666 gigawatts. The number of countries operating power reactors is the same as it was in the late 1990s. The number of countries building reactors fell from 15 to 13 last year. So that's 7% of the world's countries building reactors and 93% not building reactors. And only 3 nuclear newcomer countries are building reactors. And all 3 of those projects are largely funded by the Russian state. So apart from those 3, no other potential nuclear newcomer country has approvals and funding in place, let alone reactors under construction. Nuclear power is in decline. This is just emphasising the points I've made. Renewables have steadily grown over the past 15 years. They've reached 30%. They will reach 46% by the end of this decade, according to the International Energy Agency. And whereas nuclear power, that's the pink line there, has gone steadily down from its historic peak, and it's now down to 9%. So nuclear power costs too much. Just a few points here. Replacing Australia's coal plants with nuclear the capital cost would be $500 billion. That's trillion with a T, just for starters, in addition to all the other costs that would be required. A significant important report by IEFA. Under the Coalition's nuclear plans, electricity bills would rise by an average of $665 per household, and a 4-person household would see bills rise by $972. Smart Energy Council, based on the coalition's plan, 5 million rooftop solar systems would be curtailed to allow nuclear plants to run at their maximum capacity, which is what the coalition is claiming and planning, and the average power bill will more than double. So the coalition's deceit is that it assumes a cost of 10 billion per reactor, but the most recent project in the US cost 27 billion, in the UK 45 billion, and in France 39 billion. And CSIRO's Gen Cost report is the most significant comparative analysis of costs for electricity options in Australia. And as you can see from those figures, nuclear doesn't even come close to being competitive, with a scenario involving 90% solar plus wind plus storage costs. Nuclear power is too slow. This claim that nuclear could be operating in Australia by the mid-2030s is a lie, and there's plenty of evidence for that. France and Finland, 17 years just for construction. In the United States, 20 years for planning and construction. The UK, 20 to 25 plus years for planning and construction. So in Australia, we would need a minimum 10 years for planning and licensing, around 10 years for construction, and some years beyond that to repay the energy and carbon debts. So nuclear could not even begin to contribute to greenhouse emissions reductions until 2050. The coalition claims to support net zero by 2050, but CSIRO states that nuclear power won't be able to make a meaningful contribution to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And this is emphasised by Dr. Alan Finkel, a former chief scientist, who says any call to go directly from coal to nuclear is effectively a call to delay decarbonisation of our electricity system by 20 years. So this will result in a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions. What the coalition wants to do is to derail the energy transition, to prolong the life of coal and to build even more coal plants, to increase the use of gas, and to impose a moratorium on the development of large-scale renewables. That might be a formal moratorium, as is proposed by the Nationals, or it might be an informal moratorium, which is the inevitable effect of the coalition's current policies. So this is the most important point I want to make. The coalition will kill the energy transition, and it may not be possible to revive it later on. Investors will be spooked, supply chains disrupted, and all momentum lost. This will be a major national disaster with or without nuclear power. And forgive me, but I think that's so important that I'm going to repeat that. The coalition will kill the energy transition, and it may not be possible to revive it. And this will be a disaster whether or not nuclear power reactors get built. And one of the fundamental underlying problems is that there are climate science deniers aplenty within the coalition. And Malcolm Turnbull says that the climate science denying element in the coalition is crazy, and to some extent getting crazier. And there I've got the most recent analysis. The coalition's plan will result in an additional 1.7 billion tonnes of greenhouse emissions. So this is my last slide. I don't have time to go into it in any detail, but nuclear power is too slow. It's too expensive. It makes no sense whatsoever. And of course, it imposes these additional risks of catastrophic accidents, of nuclear weapons proliferation, keeping in mind that Australia's one and only serious previous attempt to develop nuclear power was underpinned and driven by a hidden weapons agenda, as then Prime Minister John Gorton later acknowledged. And the third category of risks that we should avoid are military or terrorist attacks on nuclear plants. And there's plenty of evidence of that in Ukraine at the moment with Russia's war and Russia's attacks on multiple nuclear sites in Ukraine. I won't go through these details. I'll finish it up. But if anyone wants this slide, please feel free to email me. There's lots of information, including a longer version of this slide presentation up at that website there, nuclear.fo.org.au. And I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jim. Very sobering stuff. As Jim said, irrespective of whether or not concrete's poured, there's a growing concern that the coalition's nuclear plan is a conscious attempt to delay and derail, or possibly, as Jim has stated, even destroy the transition to renewable energy. And when you're looking at a global trend, as Jim pointed out, of 155 times more renewable energy into the grid last year, renewable electricity, than nuclear generated electricity, 155 times more power from renewables than from nuclear as new electricity contribution into the global grid last year. To derail, delay, or seek to destroy that is, as the Clean Energy or Smart Energy Council made clear this week, profoundly damaging. What is also profoundly damaging and of course a real concern about the nuclear proposal is the impacts on health. All living creatures are affected and impacted adversely by different varying degrees of exposure to radiation, and one who's familiar in this because she has lectured in it, she's presented it in material to Melbourne University and beyond. She's a GP, she's used nuclear medicine, she's aware of nuclear benefits for medicine and risks for communities. Margaret Beavis, Margie Beavis, is the Vice President of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. She's a co-chair of the Australian Nobel Peace Prize winning international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And she was the centre of a storm before Christmas where she spoke out and warned a federal parliamentary inquiry about the risks of exposures based on contemporary medical evidence and got a real pile on. And recently Margie responded to that in the best way possible by taking the clear evidence to the federal parliament, joining with other medical practitioners and medical organisations to give a briefing on these issues to federal parliamentarians. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Margie here tonight.
Thanks, Dave. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, but also from where everyone else is coming. The plan for nuclear reactors is bad on so many levels, it's really hard to know where to start. So for me, I'm going to talk about the health aspects, including the radiation risks, the worsening climate change, the impacts for water, and also nuclear waste. Radiation causes damage to living cells, especially to our DNA. It's worse for women, and it's much worse for children. We know we have background radiation every day, but there is now clear evidence that the more you're exposed, the greater your risk of health issues is. This comes from some really gold standard research, which is very detailed, gone for over 30 years, on over 300,000 radiation workers, where they each had personal monitors of how much exposure they had. These workers were then followed to an average age of 70 because there is a time lag between when people are exposed and when they actually get the effects. And this delay meant that the radiation impacts had time to show. This study found not only increased cancers, but surprisingly also increases in heart attacks and particularly strokes. And these happened even at the lowest additional doses. There is no harmless lower level. The sales pitch from nuclear enthusiasts is that radiation is harmless. They wave bananas at us, but words are easy. I want you to think about real-world examples. Why do you think every time you get an X-ray, they ask if you are pregnant? That's because we've known since the 1950s that X-raying an unborn child increases its risk of leukemia and other cancers down the track. Indeed, there has been concern and controversy about childhood leukemia near nuclear reactors since the 1980s. In the 1980s, excess cases of leukemia and lymphoma were found around Sellafield, which is a plant in the UK. A UK government investigation unexpectedly found that the risk of leukemia and lymphoma were in fact increased. Then, in 2007, a US Department of Energy, hardly someone who you would think would want to find a problem, the US Department of Energy examined all the reliable data available worldwide and confirmed that there was, in fact, a significant increase in leukemia for children living near nuclear power plants. The clearest findings on this, and there's so much research on this and it's of so variable quality, the clearest findings on this come from a large national German study which looked at their 16 operating power plants over a 25-year period. It showed more than double the risk of leukemia for children living within 5 kilometres of a nuclear power plant. And if you look at the graphs in that study, the risk persisted as a slight increase all the way out to 50 kilometres. The impacts on climate are major. Jim spelt out the enormous increase in emissions. So basically, what does that really mean in health terms? This means it would give us worse bushfires, worse floods, worse droughts, worse heat waves. These have major health impacts, especially for regional, remote and First Nations communities. And don't forget that nuclear power reactors are in fact vulnerable to extreme weather. Fires, storms, floods and droughts all impact on reactors. Another major issue, given we're one of the driest continents, is that water. Renewables need much less water than reactors. Water insecurity is increasingly a serious health problem. When future droughts happen, will cooling reactors be prioritised over the needs of local people, local agriculture and the local environment? Nuclear accidents, Jim has touched on this, but when people tell you that nuclear power plants are safe, if they are so safe, why is it that no commercial insurance company would touch a nuclear reactor with a barge pole? If they are so safe, why does every home insurance policy in Australia, and you can go home and check your own fine print, say that they will not cover for damage from nuclear radiation? Complex systems all fail at some point, and nuclear power plants are no exception. In addition to Windscale, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, there have been at least 15 accidents involving fuel or reactor core damage, and there have been many, many near misses. Jim's also touched on attacks on nuclear facilities. Cyber attacks and sabotage by non-state actors are also possible. It only takes disrupting the power or the cooling water supply for reactors or for the spent fuel pools for long enough, only a matter of minutes, to cause meltdown and/or explosions. This could cause severe and extensive radioactive contamination requiring long-term evacuation of large areas. Indeed, here in Australia between 1983 and 2007, there have been multiple threats against the small Lucas Heights reactor, including one where explosives and detonators were found inside an electrical substation. So it could happen here. And then, last but definitely not least, there's waste. This highly toxic material needs to be isolated from the environment for over 100,000 years. The pharaohs in Egypt were 5,000 years ago. So we're talking about a really, really long time. There are no high-level nuclear waste disposal sites currently in the world anywhere. Finland may be opening one next year, but this has taken over 40 years. So when you're told as a community that the waste might be temporarily stored at the reactor, remember that temporary can be a very, very long time, and having that waste on the site increases the risks of accidents. Nobody wants this waste. Indeed, in Australia, they've been searching for a site for the very small amount of nuclear waste we have for over 40 years without success. So, in closing, I'd say the next time you see a beauty queen brandishing a banana, remember it's a sales pitch and have a reality check. Remember the X-ray signs in the radiology departments. Remember the childhood leukemia. Remember the gold standard research on workers that shows even low level of radiation increase cancers, heart attacks and strokes. Remember that no insurance company will touch a reactor. Remember that no insurance company will touch your home. Remember that communities need water when there's a drought. And remember the waste, the highly toxic waste that lasts for millennia and we're passing down to many generations. Finally, nationally, this plan is a recipe for worse bushfires, worse heat waves, worse floods and worse droughts, and worsening all the health problems that go with each of those disasters. So from a public health perspective, this plan is totally unacceptable. Sorry for the cheery news.
Well, thank you very much, Margie. I can see why those trying to advance nuclear power would want to jump on your criticisms and critiques, because that's pretty compelling and told in a dispassionate way that just builds some pretty compelling reasons for caution here. Our next speaker tonight has come to have deep concerns over the coalition's nuclear plans through her lived experience with another dirty energy source. In 2014, the Hazelwood coal mine in Gippsland caught fire and it burnt for 45 days, uncontrolled, unstoppable, and the impacts on the residents of the Latrobe Valley were widespread, and the response from the government was deficient. And from this smoke was born Voices of the Valley. Wendy Farmer is the president of Voices from the Valley, and the Latrobe Valley in Gippsland has been nominated as one of the 7 sites around Australia to host potential future nuclear reactors. Wendy has also been a key driver in connecting and linking people from those 7 communities in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia, and setting up spaces where people can explore, share and discuss strategies and concerns in a way that is out of the limelight, but makes the ability for communities to start to feel heard, something that they haven't in this process to date. And it's a great privilege to have Wendy bringing a local perspective to this Nationals push.
Thanks, Dave. And I just want to acknowledge the people that are in the room, the wool shackles and the other pro-nuclear people in the room right now. And just thank you for coming, because I think it's really important that you actually do listen to what the communities have said, because when you've come into our towns, you haven't bothered doing that. When the nuclear fantasy was announced by the Dutton government, it was basically like the 7 regions were thrown under a bus. There was no warning, there was no community consultation, there was no First Nations consultation, there was no consultation with the operators of the sites where the nuclear proposals were made for. There was no consultation with councils, states or anything else. The coalition came out with these words of, we want to build 7 nuclear power stations in the 7 regions, and these are the sites that we've chosen. We've heard AGL come out quite clearly and say that their site is not suitable for nuclear energy. There's a lot of reasons for that. It is still an operating mine and will be one of the last in Victoria to close. The mine land rehabilitation have said it will take 20, 30 years to rehabilitate that mine. So we couldn't even put nuclear on that site beforehand. When Dutton made the announcement, as I said, he didn't consult. They started then making quotes like, well, if the sites don't want to sell their assets to us, we will actually acquire them, compulsory acquire them. If the states don't want nuclear, although the states have bans on nuclear, they will overrule the states. A real bully type of announcement without any guts to it, without any plans, any ideas, just words. We've just listened to quite a few speakers that have spoken about the health impacts, the reasons why nuclear isn't suitable for Australia, and we don't need nuclear. That they also said that they would speak to the communities for 2.5 years, consult with them, but they finished with saying after that consultation, if they didn't want nuclear, we would do it to them anyway. I'm asking you, everybody on this in this forum tonight, when you go to that election this year, think about what it means. The coalition have said if they win the election, that we would have nuclear. And communities would have no right to veto. I think that's the hardest bit, that they basically, we will talk to you, but actually we're not going to listen anyway, we're going to do. Although we do see that they are listening to the pro-nuclear people. In fact, our local politician has supported the pro-nuclear people to come into our region with enticement of a beauty queen, advertised like that, unfortunately, rather than a nuclear expert of 2 years, but haven't really worked in nuclear. We should be angry, but we should use our anger for good. Angry, but anger can create great things. Anger brings us together. Anger helps us work together for good and for our communities. We know that the 7 regions that have been nominated will be played against one another by the coalition for jobs and for hope for their communities. These 7 regions have already, their operators of their assets have already got plans. These regions have already been working towards the renewable future that is coming right now. Don't think that, it's all of a sudden that people have stood together and gone, we don't want nuclear. We've already been working for many years on the transition that's happening right across Australia. And the regions have committed to work together so we don't sacrifice any region. We don't want the coalition to use the fact that one region may not be as loud as the other region to actually say, well, that's where we would put nuclear. We don't want nuclear. Nuclear is not an option for our regions, and we want to protect our families. We've got young kids even on tonight. We need to protect the future of our families. Coal regions, these coal communities have already paid the cost in health from coal, from gas. We don't need nuclear to destroy what we do have. Sorry. One of the really great things, when we look at energy and the way forward, is renewable energy is a distributed grid. And we can all play different roles in that distributed grid. And I just want to go this way, because if we were to look at nuclear, it is a one site in 7 regions. And if we have an issue, we have no energy. This has been the problem with our grid for a very long time, and for power station sites. We're seeing old power stations breaking down and we don't have energy. So the great thing about renewable energy is a system, and if one wind farm goes out, or if one solar farm goes out, or 8 houses go out and their solar isn't producing, we get it from somewhere else. Someone else is producing, someone else has stored energy, and we're getting our energy. We can have reliable, affordable energy for all with renewable energy, and we know we can't have that with nuclear. The 7 sites have been working together and have actually been, they've all participated in the inquiries. They've participated in speaking to politicians. They've participated in making sure that their communities know what is happening on the ground and the truth, especially when we've got beauty queens coming in to promote nuclear. We need to make sure that we support those regions. If you're in one of those regions, we ask you to reach out to the people that are the organisers in those regions. If you're not, ask how you can help the regions. We want Australia's support. This is not just about the 7 regions. This is about the whole of Australia and the jobs of the future. For my region, and I've lost my notes on what I did have, so I'll go, okay. My region has about $40 billion+ already allocated in proposals for renewable energy jobs. Jobs that have already started, they are happening now. Why would a coalition want to destroy that? Why would our local member want to destroy that? We have our local member that tells us they want a good conversation about nuclear and not a scare tactic. Well, you know what? To me, nuclear is scary for our families. Nuclear is scary for our regions. Fukushima is nearly 14 years ago. That community was displaced nearly 14 years ago and has not been able to return home. There may be a small risk, a slight risk, but any risk is not okay for our communities. So please reach out to your regions. We do have a 7 regions petition that may be put up. Sign that, join in, make sure that you support the regions. Together, we make a difference. Together, we can actually make sure that nuclear never happens in Australia. We do it together. And I'll pass back to Dave.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Wendy. Thanks for your efforts. Thanks for your words tonight. And as Wendy pointed out, it is very ironic that the political party that champions economic rationalism is promoting such an economically irrational activity. The free market has clearly not accepted nuclear, and it has voted with its feet and its wallet. Companies like AGL and others have no interest. The companies that transfer power and fund power in Australia have no interest in nuclear. So instead, we're looking at threats of compulsory acquisition of private property, of public funding of a sector that private energy doesn't want to fund, and the fact that Australians will pay at the power point or at the tax point for a long time to come. Really, you look at the economics underpinning this and the policy gymnastics of the coalition on this, and Robert Menzies' grave would be as unstable as that Loy Yang site. The next speaker that we have tonight is Joe Sutton. Joe's the National Communications Coordinator for the Electrical Trades Union, and the ETU is the union that covers Australia's power workers. It's the union that covers the people that keep the lights on in this country. Joe has been working with trade unions in community activism and organising for over 2 decades, so she obviously started on work experience. She has held positions as an organiser, lead organiser, political coordinator with a range of trade unions over that time, and came up through the ranks as a workplace delegate. And also along with this, a couple of years ago, Joe in South Australia was the co-coordinator of the Yes campaign. Joe's a strong voice for recognition and a strong no to radioactive risk, and it's really good to have you here and the ETU here tonight, Joe Sutton.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to everybody that's joined. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm meeting you all on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge leaders, elders past, present, and certainly leaders of First Nations community that have fought so long and so hard against nuclear power and nuclear in general. And I'd also like to thank the fellow panellists here today for their insight and their information. I'm here today, as Dave said, with the Electrical Trades Union, and the Electrical Trades Union has been out publicly and on record being anti-nuclear power, and certainly anti what the coalition are proposing for nuclear power in Australia. What I'm going to talk to you about is essentially, it's in 4 parts. The history of the ETU, I'll do it obviously in a very truncated way, but the history of the ETU with the issue of nuclear power, where that comes from and why we're in this space historically, who our members are and what they do and why they're crucial to this conversation, what jobs could look like and are looking like for electrical trade workers and for power workers in a renewable transition, and how they're at the forefront of that and working to develop that. And then ultimately the risk to these workers that this Sutton nuclear fantasy puts to them. and it really will put jobs and livelihoods at risk. So to start with the history, the Electrical Trades Union, when Australian servicemen in most particular came back after seeing the devastation of the nuclear bombs being dropped in the Second World War, they came back as staunch union members and made a commitment as their union through national consultation and decision that they would never want to see that kind of devastation happen again. And they acknowledged that nuclear power would always be a risk to that happening again. And so through their union, and for the last 70 years since that decision, so the early 50s, I think, they said, we as a union, we as electrical trade unionists and workers will be anti-nuclear because the risk is just too high. And the union has constantly gone back to its membership, consulted through national conferences, branch meetings, all of our democratic structures, and we still hold a position for those initial reasons and now ongoing reasons as to why the union is anti-nuclear power. So that sets the scene as to why the ETU has historically been and is now continuing to be in this debate. The second thing is, who are our members? As Dave said, we represent, the Electrical Trades Union represents over 60-something thousand electrical trades workers and power workers in Australia. They do the work of wiring and powering the nation. They are at the forefront of electrifying the nation as we move into transition to renewable. It's their work, their expertise, their skill that powers this country. They know what they're doing. And their jobs are at risk. We have workers who work in coal-fired power stations currently. We know those coal-fired power stations are closing. The workers know those coal-fired power stations are closing. But as we move to transition to renewable, there are plans, because those jobs exist now or are coming in the very near future, workers have the opportunity to work to make that transition the best from them. The ETU wants to see no worker left behind. We want to make sure all workers have safe, secure, well-paid jobs. The potential to do that, because of how far down the renewable pathway we are, is real. If not happening now, happening in the very near future. So our members are very attuned to the work that they do now and the work that they need to do in the future, and how the country needs to continue to be powered. And the fact that certainly in regional and coal communities, there are coal-fired power stations that are aged and they are closing down, or they are going to be closed down. And that puts workers' jobs at risk. But because they know about that transition and are an active part of it, because the detail is there and the pathway is there, members can actually be a part of the opportunity to write their future, to have a secure future. And of course, being members of their union is right there with them to do that. Where this Sutton scheme is the concern is, what is the plan for workers? And we, the Electrical Trades Union, was also presented at the parliamentary inquiry, our national leadership, and also an organiser that we have in Collie. There is a transition plan in Collie. And what was put to the inquiry and what has been said is, well, we can work on this transition now. There's a plan, there's a pathway. If everything switches to nuclear, one, we don't know how long it's going to take to build them. Best guess, as I think has been previously said, is 20 years. If the coal-fired power station is closing within this time frame, within the next 5 to however many years, but shorter term, and then the nuclear power station's not being built for 20, what happens to the power in the meantime? What happens to the workers in the meantime? We're talking about workers who are already dealing with the fact that their life and their work is transitioning. And then this just throws extra insecurity and anxiety on to that. So what the ETU knows, what members know, is that we need real plans and we need members to be front and centre of that. Dutton's plan is too little, too late, and it's too expensive. And members, ETU members, electrical trade unionists, workers need real answers as to what the future can look like, and they need the information. And currently being presented to, more broadly being presented, is that there is not enough detail in terms of what the coalition's presenting and proposing to give a secure pathway for work and prosperity for electrical trades workers And therefore, the ETU is saying, as we said before, it's too little, it's too late, it's too expensive. We can't spend however many hundreds of billions for such a low power of the grid. We know that there are renewable jobs that workers, that ETU members can work to make better and to improve and to have there for the future. It's all about making sure that workers can be front and centre of this transition. And as we move with the detail we know about renewable transition now, workers have that power. Workers can do that, and they can be front and centre of that decision making. And the presentation of the coalition's scheme around nuclear just does not have the detail. There are too many gaps, there are too many questions, and workers cannot rely on that insecurity, and the insecurity of the possibility of work that may come. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Jo. That is very clear, very powerful. Thanks so much, Jo. That's very clear and very powerful. You know, the opportunities are real, they're here, and I love that line of workers can write their own future. It is far better than working people writing blank checks. I think the energy shortfall that you've highlighted is a profound energy and economic security issue, and I think it's really important for all of us to remember that we are not starting with two energy sources, nuclear and renewables, at the same point. Renewables today, in Australia today, power 45% of this country, 75% of South Australia, 100% of Tasmania and the ACT. We're actually halfway there now with renewables, and you really have to ask, when we're shutting coal off in a decade, why would you change horses or courses halfway through? Well, one who might be able to shed a bit of light on the drivers and some of the reasons is our next speaker, Scott Ludlam. Scott has a long history in Australia's and the global nuclear-free movement and in nuclear analysis, activism, and advocacy. Scott's journey was initially inspired by the example of the world's first dedicated senator for nuclear disarmament. Happened here in Australia, Jo Valentine. And then he was later inspired by other strong women, the women Yvonne Margaret and the leaders of the Mirarr community in their opposition to the Jabiluka uranium mine, successful opposition to the Jabiluka uranium mine in the Kakadu National Park region. And through those engagements and involvements, Scott has been a really important, considered and effective advocate and activist. He's been obviously a senator and was the Australian Greens deputy leader, long-term senator, nuclear spokesperson. And Scott's experience and love of Japan and regular visiting of the areas impacted by the Fukushima nuclear disaster, the anniversary of which, as Wendy said, is looming ahead, has really driven his work. Lately, he's been taking a deep dive into the pretty murky waters surrounding the nuclear push, and look forward to hearing what Scott has to say tonight.
Thanks so much, Dave. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm a bit overwhelmed hearing that all retold, and especially that I believe Jo Valentine's on the call tonight. Hey, Jo, in the West, we've got quite a few folk on the call tonight who've been working on this issue for a lot longer than me, who've passed the stories down from the hibakusha in Japan, the hibakusha here in Australia, those atomic bomb survivors, the people who confronted the black mist and then dedicated their lives to telling the story and to making sure it never happened again. Jo and others, including you, Dave, have just been incredible mentors and teachers on this journey as we pass this on to the next generation coming through. I'm dialing in tonight from Bidjigal, Gadigal country, and I work between here and Yuin country on the south coast of New South Wales. I've been blown away tonight by the strength and clarity of the presentations, and you might wonder, how is it possible, given the coherent arguments that you've heard, whether it's economics, whether it's energy policy, whether it's health, whether it's law and culture of the First Nations people who don't want these plants on their land, whether it's local community opposition, whether it's jobs, employment, workplace rights, take your pick. How on earth has this proposal got as far as it has? Why has it even been taken seriously as a plausible energy play by a plausible alternative government in this country? And I'm hoping to shed just a little bit of light on that tonight. I've got about a dozen slides on who is behind this push, and then one slide on why. So let's go. Who's behind the nuclear push? This is a speed run of obviously a fairly complex ecosystem, a whole constellation of different organizations, but it actually boils down to a handful of people and organizations, some of who we're pleased to see on the call tonight. So welcome. We sit on your calls, you sit on ours. It's reciprocal. It's lovely. We'll go back to early 2023. Ted O'Brien, who's the opposition spokesperson on climate change for Peter Dutton, and a small delegation go on a tour of the United States and Canada. And they visit, this is where I think a lot of Kool-Aid gets drunk. You know, the bright yellow Kool-Aid is being drunk on this tour. They're on the road for a couple of weeks. And they meet with some very serious nuclear industry players in the United States. Westinghouse, which you might have thought was bankrupted, but it was bought out, I think partly by Cameco, NuScale, who were all gung-ho about small modular reactors, which Jim touched on, until they gave up a year or two ago because they realized it wasn't going to be economically viable. A couple of think tanks, but actually some pretty serious players, people who aren't just froth and bubble. Hitachi, the United States Department of Energy, Brookfield, who obviously got a big footprint here in Australia. And they were speaking to these people almost as though they were a representative of the Australian government. And I'm channeling here some really brilliant research by a journalist by the name of Murray Hogarth, and I'll put up some details on his work later in the talk. But they spend 2 weeks on the road and they're talking to very serious nuclear players. So we're having to balance two ideas in our heads here. On the one hand, that this is simply a publicity ploy. It's paper thin. They don't have the numbers, the details, or the commitment to see this through. That is true. What is also true is that there are very serious long-term nuclear industry players who, as Jim described, their industry is sick, dying, and falling apart. They are desperate to sign up new customers. That is also true. We are facing genuine risks of expansion of this industry in the country, even though you will hear some of the advocates barely have a clue about energy networks or energy markets even work. Anyway, they go on their little tour. The tour is sponsored and paid for by a group called the Coalition for Conservation, when they have as their patron a fellow called Trevor St. Baker, who's a coal industry guy who also has a side hustle in small modular reactors. The Coalition for Conservation is kind of very liberal, heavy, astroturf, think tanky kind of group. Matt Keane, former New South Wales Energy Minister, resigned from it a year or so ago because their work on trying to get Conservatives back into some sort of consensus reality on climate change, he could see that that was being sabotaged by this pro-nuclear push. So you could see on that delegation to the US and Canada, Ted O'Brien, the shadow minister, a gentleman called Professor Stephen Wilson, who is a research fellow at a thing called the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, and is also I think, an adjunct professor at the University of Queensland, and a fellow from PwC, from one of the big four consulting companies. So there's a couple of others, but that's who's on their delegation. They've got a filmmaker and so on with them as well. This Professor Stephen Wilson fellow is interesting because he works with and possibly for the Institute of Public Affairs. Now, the IPA is what's called as a think tank. British writer George Monbiot refers to them as junk tanks because they're not really thinking. They're more like lobbyists for hire. The IPA, for callers dialing in tonight from Wurundjeri country, was founded in Melbourne at the end of 1942, early 1943. It's the prototype of a neoliberal think tank. They just want governments out of the way. They want corporate power protected from outbreaks of democracy, and they've been at this for decades, longer than most of us on this call have been alive. And they were formed by the Melbourne-based mining industry at Collins House, by Keith Murdoch, Rupert's dad, who's already by 1943 amassed a substantial holding of different newspapers, assorted retail and pastoral interests, and some of the senior people who will reform the Liberal Party after the Curtin and Chifley governments during and following the Second World War. They're an extremely aggressive and influential neoliberal think tank, arguably the most influential one in Australia. They convert tax-deductible donations into policy for hire, effectively. And they have, as one of their distinguished fellows and kind of academics, in-house academics, a gentleman you might know by the name of Tony Abbott. So you get the kind of sense of what sort of outfit the IPA is. And our friend from University of Queensland is one of their research fellows. These are the sort of things that you will see at IPA events. You will see fawning performances by hopeful future and former prime ministers. You will see them bending the knee to Tony Abbott. You will see Australia's richest woman and mining oligarch and substantial IPA donor, Gina Rinehart. These are not grassroots organisations. These are the richest and most powerful people in the country by one metric, getting together to figure out how to bend public policy in the direction that their industries would like. So our friend from University of Queensland holds a seminar at the Institute of Public Affairs Strategy Retreat on the 12th of May. Again, this is channeling Murray Hogarth, who dug a bunch of this material up, at which he basically lays out what's going to become Peter Dutton's energy policy. Stop blowing up and shutting down our coal plants. We're going to need them forever. Start creating an alternative to this huge rush towards renewable energy, and install in the minds of the Australian public that we're going to need nuclear, that it's an important part of the energy mix in future. Cutting diagonally across everything you heard tonight, from everybody from Wendy on the front line to doctors to energy market specialists to people who actually live and breathe this stuff. They're going to be cutting diagonally across it. And Stephen Wilson at this thing says, our new energy research program is in the process of changing that. I've taken on the challenge with IPA staff and their executive director, supported and encouraged by a far-sighted group of donors that Nick Jorce is bringing together. I bet if we did a poll and got people to put their hands up, nobody's heard of Nick Jorce. I certainly hadn't. Who is he? He's a coal guy. Let that settle in, that the donor base for this pro-nuclear push, which is being incubated and hatched out of the IPA think tank in Melbourne, it's being funded by a coal guy, a Queensland executive chairman of Bowen Coke and Coal Limited. Now, why would the coal industry be interested in financing a competitor to coal? Now, I'm sure the penny already dropped, and it will actually have dropped in earlier speakers who belled the cat on this one. But it is this paper trail of the coal industry. We could draw links to the gas industry as well. Gas industry think tanks hastily and very busily promoting nuclear power because they know that it actually isn't a threat. It's quite the opposite. But I digress. 7th of July at the Institute of Public Affairs, Peter Dutton announces his nuclear policy, and he's drawing on Stephen Wilson's research. It's a very tight little feedback loop, hatched by this think tank because the Liberal Party has no independent policy expertise of its own to speak of, and then he announces their policy at their event, and the rest of us are just meant to swallow it up. And the IPA is one example of a think tank that exists within a larger ecosystem. So everything from CPAC or Advance, which has taken up a particularly aggressive presence in Australia since 2018, patched into the Murdoch Press, to Sky News, to their own kind of closed ecosystem of YouTube channels, Facebook groups, and blogs, AstroTurf groups, fake grassroots, the opposite of the kind of folk you've heard from tonight, who kind of pretend that there's big popular support for this stuff. So the IPA by itself can't make the kind of racket that would overwhelm the sensible arguments you've heard tonight. It all acts in concert, with the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Everything between the financiers and the people who are paying for this thing, the Trevor St. Bakers, the Gina Rineharts of the world, all the way through to politicians like Peter Dutton, who are trying to capture the leadership of the country so that he can smash up the renewable energy transition. Groups like the Centre for Independent Studies, formed in 1976 by mining industry capital and a fellow who worked for Rupert Murdoch at the Adelaide Advertiser. This stuff is intergenerational. One of the founders, Neville Kennard of the Centre for Independent Studies, his son goes on to found Advance 40 years later. So this stuff is just like our stories of the Hibakusha being passed from generation to generation. So is this tiny, airless little influence network being passed on from parent to kid. And you'll see some of the same names show up over and over again. Advance isn't playing a central role in the pro-nuclear push. They're leaving that to others, but everybody's doing their bit. They've got this not zero thing. They've collected 12,000 signatures on a pro-nuclear push to power up Australia, and they're claiming and putting up billboards saying renewables will cost the earth. Billboards that are so toxic that even the billboard company ripped them down about a fortnight ago in Newcastle. So it's a full court press, and that explains why this cacophony appears to be coming from everywhere. Actually, it's coming from a tiny handful of people. This is the newest startup. I believe we have some of their reps on the call tonight, and it's good that you're here. I learn stuff when I sit in on your webinars. I'm hoping that you've learned some things with us tonight as well. Founded December 2022, so a relative newcomer to the ecosystem, claiming that it's a grassroots movement. It's not. It's funded by Dick Smith, who's worth something in the order of 60 million bucks. They've got millionaires, we've got each other, and that's why we're going to prevail. But it only works if it's part of an ecosystem. And a quick look back to where this thing kind of fits, not just nationally, but in the global scale, is that some of the organizations you've heard from tonight, not Advance as far as we know, but the Centre for Independent Studies, the IPA, a handful of others, are formal affiliates of a US-based organization called the Atlas Network. And here we draw very heavily on the work of UTS senior academic, Dr. Jeremy Walker. Look up his material, because his deep dive into the fact that what's happening in Australia, where you get these small knots of billionaire-funded organizations functioning as an ecosystem and all cross-pollinating each other, it's happening in Brazil. That's how they got Bolsonaro. It's happening in Argentina. That's how they got Javier Milei. It's happening in Aotearoa in New Zealand. That's how come they're having this huge fight over the Treaty of Waitangi and the rollback of the offshore oil and gas drilling ban in New Zealand. And of course, it's happening in the United States, where an affiliate of the Atlas Network known as the Heritage Foundation just drafted Donald Trump's Project 2025. So we're not alone in this, but what we are experiencing here, this kind of well-funded, very sudden, seemingly out of the blue influence campaign to do something completely deranged, is happening all over the world. There are 581 affiliated organizations, whatever that means, of the Atlas Network, based out of Washington, DC. Well, we're experiencing the impacts of one of their local campaigns, and the best thing we can do is beat it here. Here's a quick example of how it works. If you look at the kind of bare bones of this influence network back in, say, early 2022, you've got a handful of long haulers still just plugging away on pro-nuclear. The Minerals Council, who I believe are also represented on our call tonight, welcome. I hope you're putting in some overtime there. Handful of fellows, a handful of long haulers working on nukes, but no one is really listening. And then you fast forward to now, say really to the middle of 2023, after O'Brien's excellent adventure in the United States, and the whole network is lit up. They're all on each other's blogs, they're all on Sky News, they're all co-hosting, cross-pollinating at each other's webinars and think tanks and unbelievably dreary presentations. I'm sorry, guys, but really pretty dull. But that's this kind of collective impact that they get, where you have a handful, a couple of dozen people. You could reel off their names. It doesn't take that much to memorize them, creating this enormous collective impact and impression as though there's this huge grassroots campaign and hundreds of thousands of people demanding nuclear. It isn't there. It doesn't exist. That's why they call it AstroTurf. It's fake media, fake news, fake community groups, and fake research. None of it's real. But it's our job to cut through that bullshit and make sure people, including our neighbours, understand what's being done to us. That's the who, and this is the why. Most speakers name-checked and referenced this on the way through. These are industries that are used to sucking money out of households and out of major energy users alike to sell coal and to sell gas, and they're watching their market disappearing before their eyes by distributed, as Wendy said, stuff on your roof, battery installations in your carport, community-owned wind farms, collective energy and collective power is eating their market, is destroying their market. And this is the last-ditch attempt. This election is it. If we can beat them this time, nuclear will be off the table forever. They'll come up with some other dirty trick campaign in 3 years' time, but we have to knock this thing off. That's why you heard John Grimes on ABCRN during the week calling this a sliding doors moment. This is it. So whether you're interested in nukes, whether you're a clean energy campaigner, whether you're interested in coal, whether you're just trying to stop a bad idea over your back fence, you have to be an anti-nuclear campaigner for the next 2, maybe 3 months. So, Murray Hogarth, look up Jeremy Walker and visit don'tnuketheclimate.org.au and stay in the fight. This is, we passed from the marathon stage to the sprint, and I wouldn't be doing it with anybody else. So thanks for being here.
And thanks for joining us and sharing that, Scott. Thanks to all the speakers tonight. Thanks for your patience to listeners. We're going a little bit longer, but it's absolutely imperative stuff and really, really important stuff. Thanks to Scott. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to the Don't Nuke the Climate, SLF and ACF folks for supporting this evening. But above all, thanks to you who are listening. Your work, or most of your work, have not everybody, and like others have said, there's different views. Let's have a fair income discussion, because if it was a fair income discussion, this would end. If it's shadowy politics and dirty dollars driving bad policy, it's a risk. That's what we're facing. Fair income conversation, we would clear the decks and we would have a future that's renewable and not radioactive. I really want to thank people in this call who have been, efforts have been really important in the past, and they will be vital in the future. There's a few things coming ahead. It's a busy time with high stakes. We have a couple of important webinars. Next Thursday, the 27th, 12 till 1 Eastern, is ANFA, a really important network, the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, a black-green network working in solidarity and respect to protect country from nuclear threats. Having a webinar, details there. Also, really important to know that on the 11th of March, it's the 14th anniversary of Fukushima. Now, this was a modern era accident, not an old Soviet accident, modern era, technically sophisticated, rich nation with an established nuclear industry. It was not planned, it did happen. It was fueled by Australian uranium, and we must ensure that there is never a chance of a Fukushima here, because those facilities and reactors are not built. There's a National Day of Action. Please do what you can. There's everything from marches and prayer vigils through to letters to the editor and social media elevation. We want to remind our fellow citizens on that day that Australia's future is renewable, not radioactive, and there's no place for a Fukushima in our country. There's a host of websites there. Check them out. There's resources in the chat. Capture that before we go. But above all, stay engaged, be active. Thanks so much for attending. We will send a copy of this to people, and you know how to reach us through Don't Nuke the Climate, through ACF, Friends of the Earth and others. Questions, queries, ideas, we're all open. We're out of time tonight, so I'll just close by saying thanks so much. Stay well, in touch and active.